Hello, friends, family, fellow patriots. Lord Stompy here. Welcome. This is my first video in quite a while. I believe it's my first video since the new year. So, to all my friends, family, fellow patriots, God bless you all, and all the best for the new year. So, first of all, things are very, very different for me at my end. On New Year's, I made some resolutions. Number one, I gave up drinking. I'm going to allow myself to have one beer per month. I've already partially failed that. So far this month I've had 2 beers. But that's pretty good, right? So it's not that I was a heavy drinker before this, but I tended to have about 10 beers a week. And that's just too much. Already I'm feeling a lot better since I drastically cut back on alcohol. I'm a lot clearer. Second thing I did, New Year's resolution number 2, was I just gave up my hobby of doom scrolling through my social media. And this has been very helpful too. As I'm becoming massively more productive. So for the new year, I am determined to dedicate my time to this. I'm currently recording a new album. For those of you who don't know, my albums are available on Bandcamp. If you look up Lord Stompy on Bandcamp, there's a link down below. Or if you're keen on donating to my channel, any donation you send, there's a link down below, but any donation you send over $5, I will send you one free album. And it will be a really good album too. You can count on that. My third New Year's resolution was I was actually going to start to read physical books. Look at that. And the physical book I picked up the other day from a second-hand store. Something I didn't know about, something quite important. The Notorious Life of Jip, right-wing anarchist in fin de siècle, France. Now, Jip is actually a right-wing woman, and a very strange right-wing woman at that. Her name is actually Gabrielle Mirabeau, and she was one of France's most prolific authors in the late 19th century, going through to the early 20th century. She wrote over 100 books. She was very far right. Basically, she had a massive distrust of liberalism and democracy. She was the last of a line of nobles in France, and what was particularly interesting about this book, and I do recommend it, it's not just looking at Gabrielle Mirabeau's life, but it's a really good overall view of far-right politics in France in the late 19th, early 20th century. Now, Gabrielle, who was known as Jip, she was basically a proto-fascist. She was this interesting connection. The older generations of her family, including one of her grandfathers, had actually fought in the one of her grandfathers fought in the French Revolution on the side of the king. Now, she was heavily influenced by this grandfather. But then she had all these other older male relatives. Everybody seemed to be involved in wars or skirmishes throughout the earlier to mid and latter 19th century. Now, famously, the Prussians invaded France. When was that? That was like about 1870 or something. And you had this really strange mixture of really old school right-wing French patriots and this new school of left-wing socialist French patriots that were born out of the French Revolution. The French Revolution was basically it was a lower class revolution, but it was spearheaded by such groups as the Freemasons, the Jewish money powers, just various liberal groups who wanted liberalism and democracy. So Freemasons, Jews, progressive types of people. They were all the left-wing camp. And the right-wing wanted to preserve, the main things they wanted to preserve was the traditional Catholic Church, the monarchy, and the nobility. They wanted to keep France in basically in a kind of feudal state of affairs. Now, when Napoleon came on the scene, he was somewhat of a blend of the older France, where basically Napoleon saw himself as a new kind of regent, a new kind of king. He was basically a glorified warlord, essentially. So Napoleon was, in some ways, was against the former nobility and the feudal system of France, because basically he wanted the power for himself. He didn't want this aristocratic class that was born into wealth and power, this inherited wealth and power. Here, Napoleon was a very dynamic and brave man. He thought that power should be seized. He was actually quite correct on that point there. And as I was reading through this book, a very interesting factor ended up happening. Was during the 19th century, you saw this, there began to become somewhat of a symbiosis and a fusion of the certain left-wing patriotic ideas regarding France. And that was melding with some of the ideas of the older nobility and their right-wing views. And so by the late 19th century, this sort of mixture of views was beginning to turn into a proto-fascist vision. And that's exactly where Gyp, this French writer and political activist, began to really make her mark. She was considered a feminist because she was a very strong vocal woman. She was self-employed, which is actually quite rare for women. She was self-employed, doing newspaper articles, writing books, basically being a professional right-wing rabble-rouser. And this was very unladylike. In the older right-wing traditions of France, women generally kept to a very, very traditional position within society. They weren't particularly vocal. They raised the children. They just supported the state from behind the scenes. Whereas Jip was actually quite aggressive. She was that notorious that at one point she got attacked by acid. Some random person like tipped sulfuric acid over her. And another time she had an assassination attempt. She really riled up, especially the far left. But at the same time, she had some sympathies with the far left. She was smart enough to see that the French noble classes, as they stood, as much as she did support them, she saw them as being inherently decadent, degenerate, self-serving, lacking backbone, lacking a will to power. And she was very vocal about this. Essentially, the French nobility of the late 19th century, they wanted a return to a pre-democratic, more feudal order that their ancestors had lived under. They wanted inherited aristocratic rights for their group of people, and essentially, by the late 19th century, they just wanted the privilege of lounging around in absinthe dens and clubs, just talking about all these pseudo-intellectual subjects and not really contributing much, and they weren't a particularly cohesive, vital force like they were in the old days. And that's comes through particularly in the book on Jip's life, is that they in the earlier 19th century, the French nobility, the males, they wouldn't hesitate to jump on their horse and ride off and join a war or a skirmish if they thought that was in the best interests of France and the basically keeping France powerful and strong. The men of that era saw it as their duty. And several generations later, by the time Jip had grown up and was in her middle ages, you ended up with this cafe society, this Parisian cafe society that was mostly composed of nobles, but increasingly there was these nouveau rich class, these people that were merchants, bankers, stock market traders, money changers. A lot of these people were Jews. Now, Jip and her friends rightly saw that liberalism and democracy were enemies of a strong and vital France. She saw liberalism and democracy as being agents that would weaken her nation. And furthermore, Jip and her friends saw the rise of a new nouveau rich class, and especially the Jews. This was the first time in the late 19th century France, was the first time really when anti-Semitism really came to popular notice. to the point that even the average worker on the street was beginning to spout anti-Semitic views. Now, most of these views were based on sound reason. Sure, there was a lot of also hysteria mixed in with these views, but the average working class person, through to the noble classes, could see with their own eyes the rise of this new Jewish banking and mercantile class. And they quite rightly predicted that this class of people, this Semitic group, didn't have France's best interests at heart. And so this is where Gyp really made her name as a proto-fascist. She was one of the first people in Europe to really start hammering on the JQ, to the point it actually cost her a lot in her personal life. She was hated by the progressives and the far left. She was hated by the moderates. However, with the older aristocracy and a large section of the working class people, they agreed with Gyp and they got behind her. So this is all very interesting to look at if we see the history of basically the far right in France and the rise of noticing in France. That's what Gyp was. She was an early noticer. So what we're seeing is, in the late 19th century, conditions that are quite similar to now in many ways. There are a lot of similarities. We have a rise of noticing from the high class European folk down to the lower classes, and essentially, now that I've got more than halfway through this book, I can tell you why these people failed. The reason these people failed is the reason we're failing now. It's a really important reason. So just listen to my analysis of this. It's something we all need to consider. Right. So when it came to Gyp and her friends, they had reached a point in the latter parts of the 19th century where France had been very turbulent. They'd had the French Revolution, they'd had Napoleon, they'd had the Prussian invasion, and there was a few smaller things. The whole 19th century was a very turbulent time for France, and it had really caused a massive toll on the right-wing, more traditionalist classes of people. It caused a massive toll. A lot of them had lost everything over the decades, and essentially the noble classes that were left, most of them realized if they didn't rock the boat too much, that they would be allowed to keep their lands and their wealth and their privileges. Right. So the left wing in France, the progressive bloc in France, by the late 19th century was very, very strong. And the noble classes had good cause to fear the left. It had done a lot of damage to them. So essentially, the nobility and the far right of France, which also included various working class people too, the far right in France, they had come to this point where they would complain publicly about democracy, liberalism, Jews, but when it actually came to asserting their will in public in a unified, strong way, if they really stood up and began meaning business, it would have caused a huge left-wing backlash against them. And this basically terrified them. I mean, it's not exactly in this book, but I can see why. So what you ended up having was this late 19th century pseudo-intellectual cafe society where all of these kind of people would sit around planning, oh, we're going to restore the monarchy, we're going to restore the Catholic Church to its former glory, we're going to retake control of France. And they were publishing newspapers, they were publishing books, occasionally they'd hold a rally, but when it came to really pushing their presence forcefully, they never did that. Now, things got so far that there was a general in France in the late 19th century, Georges Boulanger. I think I said that right. Georges Boulanger. Now, he was highly popular far right. He terrified the left wing. He ended up quitting the army and running in politics. He did very well. And the far left were terrified that he'd turn himself into a dictator, a French dictator like Napoleon. So he was this massive target of all the progressives in France. Now, what was really interesting was the progressive left in France, highly organized, highly energized. They weren't afraid to flex their muscle in public. They weren't afraid to take the fight to the enemy. This is where the far right in France failed. At the last minute, when it came to taking the fight to the enemy, they never really pushed through. This is the position we're in now. Right, we've got all these cafe intellectuals, all these talkers, got all these far right stuff online. We all sit around planning, when we take over, we go, well, if you're going to take over, you have to use force. That's what the progressive left has done for more than a century all across Europe. This is why they're in charge. You have to have unity. This is something we don't have. And once you have unity, then you've got to be prepared to push through with force, and you have to be prepared to make massive sacrifices. The far left in France, Gyp actually admitted this in her own writings. She said she had a grudging respect for the far left because they had huge amounts of energy. They just weren't afraid to really bravely push as hard as they could. And this is the problem we have now here in the modern day far right. We've had this problem for more than 100 years. We have a lack of unity, a lack of will, and a lack of cohesive energy. until we actually confront these problems and start to rectify them, we're never going to get beyond the phase that these guys never got beyond the phase of talking in cafes, publishing newspaper articles and books, having the occasional demonstration. Right? This far right guy Belanger, he ended up having to flee France. He got hounded out of politics by the progressive left, who were far more energetic and organised. Then they started to draft up some treason laws, and they claimed he'd broken the treason laws. And it's true, he did want to overthrow democracy. He did want to be a dictator. Except he didn't have the guts to force any of this through. So he fled his own country and committed suicide in Belgium, of all places. So this is a problem we've had for a long time. And this is why I'm enjoying reading this book, because here we have basically the French history of proto-fascism. Okay, you had these mostly nobles with some working class backing, all wishing for a return to an older order, an older French order. And as the 19th century progressed, some of their ideas and their beliefs and their philosophies updated, and suddenly there was quite a lot of women, like Jip in the far right. So basically, the far right in the late 19th century was being influenced by progressive ideas about women and the class structures. Some of that was actually filtering through to the far right. You know, at the end of the 19th century, there was some loose affiliations between certain far right individuals like Jip and certain far left revolutionaries. As Jip said in her own books, she said she had a grudging respect for the far left because they had conviction, energy. They were going around bombing places. The far left anarchists in France, they were crazy. They were basically Antifa on steroids. So once again, as I said, this is very reminiscent of the time we're in now. Most of their problems in 19th century France, essentially a lot of it is very similar to what we're facing today. And it's very, very interesting to see the historical timeline of this very traditionalist France that Jip grew up in. And, you know, the time of her grandparents where people were fighting for the kings, they were fighting for Napoleon. The men just were basically every second male, every second older male in Jip's family was a war hero. It's just the way it was back then. And then by the later 19th century, this affliction of comfort ended up overtaking the nobility. The old sense of duty to the traditional order kind of began to fade, and this lifestyle of leisure and comfort took its place. And it was easier to hang out in absinthe dens and cafes and talk about a revolution, rather than actually having your right-wing revolution and making the sacrifices necessary. As very interesting to see this timeline. Jip's older relatives were not afraid to make any sacrifice necessary for the protection of traditional France. And then once she grew up, you saw this new class of basically right-wing libertarians. They were just like, oh, well, the world's becoming more and more about trading and money and capitalism. And hey, we're pretty rich people. We may as well join in. It's the way the world works now. We're not into having these old-fashioned wars on horseback and riding around for the honour of kings or emperors and this old order. We'll talk about the old order and reminisce about it to our heart's content and occasionally shout about it in the streets. It won't go any further than that. So, anyway, they're my thoughts for now. I'm going to continue my New Year's resolutions. I'm going to read more books. But I highly recommend this one. Now, of course, it's written by Willa Z. Silverman. I'm assuming they're a Jew. It was put out by Oxford Press. So essentially, it does have a very liberal bias. The writer has a very liberal bias. If you can get over the fact, if you can ignore the fact that the writer of this book is always going to be saying that Jip's anti-Semitism is just a mental and emotional disorder. This is what the author keeps saying. Then you will come to the and you are able to just read it as a historical document. You will come to pretty similar conclusions to the conclusions I've had, but overall, highly recommended, and I really liked Jip as a character. Now, she had her faults. She was very silly, very hot-headed, impetuous, very French. A French woman, would you believe? Typical opinionated, loudmouth, hothead French woman. But overall, she was pretty smart. She read the room correctly back in the late 19th century. Democracy and liberalism were a decadent, corrosive force that was going to undermine France. Yeah, she got that correct. And Jews. She got all of those things correct. And she foresaw the fact that the far left had the energy, the vigor, and the willpower. The will to power that her right-wing friends didn't have. It's something that bugged Jip all her life. And it's something that bugs me now. It's something that should bug you too. This has been our problem for more than 100 years. A lack of unity on the right and a lack of will to power. Okay, my friends. Thank you for listening. God bless you all. Deus Vult.